welcome to Nadia.
Thank you. Beautiful. That's me. Hi. Nice to see everyone, and nice to be here in Berlin. I came in yesterday on the train, and it's very cool to be here at Hatch. Thanks, Damien, for the invite. So we had contact a bit earlier in the year, I think in like May or April even. And Damien asked me to speak about AI in design. That's kind of what I do, but I'm quite in a critical place at the moment, or critical, like, point of view when it comes to AI. So I was like, can I make my talk a little bit like not that excited about AI and more critical? And he's like, yeah, if you feel like that's important, you can do that. So that's what we'll do. And so I've seen there's some amazing talks at the conference as well around how AI can support designers, or how we should deal with, generative tools and how they can, make our work more interesting and creative and focus more on the fun parts. But I would actually like to talk a bit more about what designers can do for AI. So how can we, as designers, as a very broad, spectrum of practices, how can we sort of steer AI into a direction that we would want to be part of, kind of. So that's what I'll talk about. Before I do, where do all these ideas come from? So I'm Nadia Piet. I'm a freelance designer and researcher. I do a lot of different things, but I feel like those umbrella terms kind of encapsulate most of my work. And I'm the founder of AIX Design, which started as a sort of Slack community like 5-6 years ago. I sort of came into this AI space myself. I mostly have a background in like UX design and surface design. And at the time I was getting, just very interested in this idea of like semi-adaptive, autonomous, intelligent tools instead of more like static apps, and like how would we interact with those. So I got very interested in that, ended up doing sort of my bachelor thesis at the time on it, and made a toolkit for other designers trying to like wrap their heads around this. And out of that sort of naturally flowed the AIX design community, which at the time was for anyone that somehow found themselves at that intersection, right? So it could be people that were working as UX designers in organizations, and suddenly they had some machine learning features and they had to do explainability, and they didn't really know actually how to sort of navigate that. But also people from more, say, like artistic sort of backgrounds, or like critical making. Just throw them all into a Slack channel, basically. And over the past few years, that's grown out. And now I would say we're like an online community, decentralized studio for like critical and creative approaches to AI. And we often say like, sort of thinking about AI outside the confines of big tech and Elon and Jeff and the gang. Because I think it's important for us to also think about this, technological development and like new material from other sets of values that don't prioritize kind of stakeholder value over anything else. We won't probably break capitalism, but that's okay. We can still do things. I was also the head of creative technology at Dept, which is a creative agency, global creative agency. And when I'm not behind a computer, which isn't that much, I'm probably spotting nudie branches, which are really cute, cool underwater sea slugs with crazy colors. If you want to see something cute today, Google nudie branch. Or I'm probably on the mat doing yoga. So that's me, really briefly, and I'll give you a little quick visual impression of what some of the work looks like. We just wrapped up this artist residency, which I was organizing around AI in animation, and working together with creative technologists and filmmakers, pairing them up to sort of figure out, cool, what can we do with AI in animation, but also how do we feel about that? Do we want that? How does it like shape our creative practice? And how do we sort of situate ourselves as filmmakers, storytellers, creatives in this new era? And then we sort of like vomit all these insights and experiences and conversations we've had in the past 6 months into a report, which is really hard, but we tried our best. So kind of this like practice-based research is a lot of what I do. We just started a program now with Better Images of AI. I don't know if anybody knows the project, but they started because all the images we see of AI, they're like humanoid robots, always white men, right? And the hand with like the Adam's creation, and they're all tropes. They're not very original, but also they don't help people, especially like general sort of public, build mental models around AI, right? They're misleading, and they're just tropey and boring. They're always like blue and gray, and it's not an accurate representation, but it's also not an interesting one. So we're starting a sort of, we've partnered as AX Design with this organization called Better Images to commission artists to try and create better visual language for some of these topics around AI. So that whenever we host an event or a blog, we don't have to put the humanoid robot there. So that's something we're doing, and sort of doing research around, yeah, that visual language. I'm working on a project now, sort of imagining like UX for AI and thinking through that. A few years ago, I made like AI films and did a lot of this like generative AI stuff back when you actually had to code for it, and it was really difficult, and that kind of made it fun, and now I've kind of lost interest. But yeah, sort of more experimental, like artistic work, working with museums, thinking about how to like use emerging technology to make the museum or like archive experience more accessible, more immersive, like bringing these things to life with AI, but also like AR or blockchain things. Yeah, I'm gonna skip the rest. Sometimes I code when I have the patience. Sometimes I make design tools for other designers, like this card deck. And a lot of the work we do, yeah, is like workshops and sort of building literacy or trying to make stuff together and sort of work through questions we have in community. And a lot of that we do online. So that's me. Really curious who's in the room. Just quick show of hands. I know we're all designers, but like that can mean so much these days. Who spends part of their days user testing? Okay, quite a few. I thought so. Coding? Writing code, programming. Okay, hi nerds. Writing papers, like trying to do, you know, APA style referencing, all that. Nice, going through it as well. And educating, doing like workshops or actually teaching, or nice, cool. I'm always curious about this because design just means so many different things these days, right? So I'm just curious, like, what do we actually spend our days doing? Yeah, so last year, this is kind of this is like how 2022 was for me in my head. We had been kind of in this niche, doing AI for design for years, but it was really crappy, and it was really just weird, nerdy, artistic people doing that. And then last year, obviously, the technology became so much better, but most importantly, it got a graphical user interface, right? Instead of having to code or just run like a Colab notebook or some simple like Python script, now you had a little, you know, slash, imagine, front, like there were simple user interfaces that then made it accessible for anyone else. And sometimes mentally I compare this to like, I don't know, the early days of the internet when only like people who could code could make websites, and then you got like website builders, right? So it's like that kind of switch from it being a practice that requires like technical expertise to something that kind of anyone can do. So yeah, it went rogue, hey? Like it just exploded. And on the one hand, that's really exciting because there's lots of things I think are interesting, especially like democratization, and yeah, we're just able to like, this just the barrier between your imagination and having something to show other people, that, you know, becoming easier, I think is really exciting. But I felt a bit like this. Like the hype is hella real, and it felt like a lot was being snowed under. You know, a lot of the things that I felt were really important to think about around AI were just not really getting any attention anymore, or very little compared to, whoa, this person launches another tool and this organization is now. So yeah, I want to do a little bit of that today, talk about the gorilla. which I just frame as design for AI rather than AI for design. So how do we, need this material? How do we shape it into something that we feel is meaningful? And this was very much a question I was asking myself as well. I was like, God, the space has changed so much. What feels meaningful, actually, for me to work on, to like channel my efforts towards? So I have 5 areas. In my head, they're way more, connected and fuzzy and whatever, but you need to structure a talk, so I've tried to make 5. And I'll take you through them. So one, and there's also a roundtable after, so I'd love to chat to you more about them after. But one is like protecting people and planet from harm. So very often AI is kind of, in mainstream media, it has this sort of like magic aura, like, oh, wow, suddenly it can do this. And please do not fall for that. And remember that it has a very real, like, physical infrastructure. It's very laborious to create these models, right? So I saw this stat the other day, which sort of showed how much computational power and then energy it took to like train GPT 3.5. And it's insane. It's way more than any of our showers and plastic takeaway and all of that together, right? Which isn't to say it's, I see that as like a design challenge. How can we create machine learning models? How can we train them? But also how can we deploy them in ways that are less energy intensive? And so there is work around that, such as like federated machine learning, which is both better for privacy and better for sort of the ecology because it runs the models on your phone. So there's like technical solutions for that. There's probably design solutions for that. But right now it's, pretty heavy. And I feel like there's enough warming the planet as we have it. And then another one that I think is really important to acknowledge is sort of the labor of data annotation, data collection, data annotation. So a classic example is like Instagram has a filter that protects you and me from seeing violent content. But in order for that model to work, many someones actually, have to go through hours and hours and hours of like watching content and labeling whether there's violence or not, right? In order for an AI to do it, actually, people need to do it for lots of hours. And you can imagine, for example, with violent content, but also, just lots of fucked up shit on the internet. And people have to go through that to create these sort of like moderation tools. So what's really helpful in the end is like, can we take care of, the labor that's involved in that, do that in like better conditions, at least like acknowledge that as well. Because currently I can tell you those things are not being done under very fair conditions. So I think as designers, this is something, this is a way bigger problem, but it's also something we can sort of compartmentalize into, hey, how can we, for our product, right? We can't fix the world, but for your product, whatever your sort of influence is over, can you see if you can sort of build a better, more equitable chain in terms of labor and reduce your footprint? So that's one. If you'd like to learn, read more about this, there's this amazing project, which maybe some of you know because it's like a classic in the AI space, but it's Atlas of AI by Kate Crawford, which is the book. And she has this ginormous infographic made with that, which is a visualization of the entire value chain of AI from, from the minerals being, mined, to the data being trained or like collected and annotated and so on to the deployment. The graph specifically is for Amazon Echo, but I think it's so insightful and it's just this amazing like visual depiction of it as well that I feel is really, really powerful to both understand it, but also to say you're an educator, open up this conversation, just print this thing out in extra large and, it will do so much explaining for you, so I think that's an incredible project. The second thing I think we can do as designers is bring ethics into interfaces. So there's a lot of work, and also, for example, the EU AI Act and things like this, around high-level ethical guidelines. AI should respect human agency. AI output should be explainable. And I think when we read this, we're like, yep, that sounds good. Yeah, let's do that. We can align on the guidelines, and that's great. That's a great first step. But of course, the difficult part is like, how do these things then translate into a product or a service, right? And me as a user, these AI systems are very intricate and whatever, but I interact with them on my tiny little phone screen with little, buttons and whatever. So it's like, how do we bring these high-level guidelines into that actual interaction? And how can we sort of maybe protect the user or like support user agency? How can we support that experience? What do these things actually look like in practice? And there's incredible work around this already. Specifically, explainability, I feel like, has a lot of good, like design patterns already. But I feel like there's so much, more we could do, and actually much more that the user interface could do as kind of being this bridge between the system and the user, like the impact and the organization. And I think it's, we have, hopefully, the imagination to bring those things into practice. So I think that's also, an important one. And especially if you end up, I don't know, I've been in a lot of these, where it's like, maybe the system should be like that, should be like that, and it's a very high-level conversation. But ultimately, what does that value, for example, agency, how does that translate in your product, right? It's very different if you have education tool or, healthcare or your Spotify, recommendation. It means different things in different contexts. So, let's use our design brains, imagination brains for that. Two sort of examples of what that looks like in a project. The one on the right, I think, is actually quite interesting. Also, we're in Zalando HQ city, right? So they've noticed how bias kind of surfaces within their platform, not just, right, like bias can come from the data set, but it can also emerge with behavior. And sometimes very often it just mirrors like societal bias. And even if that's not really your fault or it's kind of like correct for what people expect, I think we still have a responsibility to step into that or not. Another example is like Airbnb, right? Sometimes people are racist, they're on Airbnb, and so that behavior unfolds also on Airbnb. You could say, hey, look, we're just Airbnb. That's not really our problem. But I know Airbnb, for example, for one, is really trying to experiment with like different little affordances or little different information hierarchy in user profiles to see if they can kind of skew that. So I think there's that. And this one from Zalando is they realize that when people search nude cocktail dress, they get this color, right? And while that is what most people may expect, because if you're not this color, not to search for nude, because that's not going to be, the color. But they sort of, saw that somewhere in their user feedback sessions and addressed it like that. And I think very often with AI, it's not just like right or wrong. The AI is not just wrong when, things being correct isn't in the real world such a binary sort of thing. So even if this is correct for the algorithm, it isn't like correct for the impact we want. So I feel like there's a big gap often between those things. And your engineers will, they have different brains. Like engineers have different brains, thank God. God knows we need them. Like I could not do what they do. But I feel like as designers, it's our role to sort of question those gaps between, what's like intended and in the technical and what's actually people's lived experience there. The other one, this is, one I'm working on, or like a project I'm working on, where we're kind of questioning like what would be the opposite of like deceptive patterns, or what people previously called like dark patterns. What would be the opposite of that? Like what would be sort of very idealistic, like the ideal algorithmic interaction, very blue sky thinking. And I'm just like, for example, my Netflix algorithm, it always like puts you in a hole, right? Like you're in the filter bubble and they think I want that, but I find it really boring there because it's like just the same stuff I've been watching and I know exists. And I find it really weird that I cannot communicate back about that and say, hey, algorithm, can you actually just like give me more random stuff? Like, can you do less personalization for me and make it just like more, you know, plural, more like, yeah, diverse? Or even this, like what if you could sort of set an intent? So you're like, you know what, I know I always watch freaking Hollywood films and all I do is watch Marvel, but I would like to watch some more art housey stuff. And that you could sort of indicate that to an algorithm, because I think there's a lot of assumptions about what we do is what we want, right? We know as humans, our behavior is not really always like that. So I would love a world in which we can, yeah, like communicate more directly with our algorithms to make them work for us, like customize them or tailor them, which, you know, is technically possible. So it's like just sort of from a design or interaction point of view, what would that even look like? If you know about any tools doing this, maybe you're doing this, come tell me about it, because I'm like, feels like an obvious thought, but I'm not seeing it much in tools. So if you know any, tell me. Then 3, uncovering the potential of a new medium with lovely Aladdin GIF. So I'm very critical of AI, but it's not just all bad either. There's some incredible things it can do, and there's really like a whole new range of possibilities that open up because we now have machine learning systems, AI, like LLMs, you know, they're really new ways of like seeing the world, interacting with the world, making things for the world. And there's this whole new range of like possibilities, like synthetic media, like interactive generative storytelling, embodied interactions, right, like gesture interface and stuff. All this stuff is super exciting. For things like language learning, you know, like multimodal interaction. There's so much incredible stuff that comes from it as well. So while I am very critical, I'm also trying not to, reject it altogether, right? Because that would be a waste. So yeah, please resist. And I see this a lot. I feel like the discourse in AI is very hype or hate. It's like, oh, this is sick. We're gonna do, you know, this is gonna solve everything. Or, ooh, this is really problematic, bad, bad, bad. And I'm like, the most helpful thing I think we can do is be sort of in the middle, you know, and be like critically engaged and question where it is or isn't helpful. And instead of framing problems, like turning them into, you know, design challenges, which is what we do, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential as well that we shouldn't sort of just chuck out because there are so many problems. 2 that I really, really like. One is called fingerspelling, and it's just this like American Sign Language learning tool that does hand tracking. And you can just like, this is just such a more intuitive, like just plain better way to learn this than from a book, right? Specifically because it's something you do, yeah, you perform this embodied. So to learn it through an embodied method would just make so much sense. And this is only possible because of like, yeah, post-estimation technologies and blah, blah, blah. So I think, yeah, there's incredible potential as well for embodied interaction, also in terms of accessibility there. And then the second one is a project from Oyo Studios. They do lots of cool things around AI and design. A lot of like prototypes and experiments, like super creative. I love it. And this is one they did with Space 10, rest in peace Space 10. And basically they looked at, look, how can generative AI maybe help us come up with more like situated, localized design solutions. So they've created this system that takes data on waste materials from a specific region. So this one is Copenhagen, but they did this globally. They also have one for Oaxaca in Mexico. Like they did this globally, looking at, look, what's the most, what's most of the waste materials in this space? And then they created this like generative AI system to then imagine how you would create like plates and cutlery from that specific material. And I think that's really, yeah, really interesting, because we could do that, but we would have to do it, you know, manually and so on. And I think this specifically is so interesting for AI, can just like adapt to the live data, right, at all times. Like it's almost like a real-time sort of adaptation. So if the waste materials change, that changes, right? No one has to be like, hey guys, stuff changed, we need to think about it again. And just at scale, right? We could do this maybe for what, 10, 20, 50 places, 100, but the world's a lot of different places with their own ecosystems and their own waste and so on. So I think for sort of these design solutions at scale, but also like, yeah, localized, like data-driven, I think it's really interesting what sort of new, yeah, like design flows that opens up to. So yeah, as we stay critical of AI, let's also think about these places where it might, you know, be beneficial, meaningful, helpful for us to use. And then, yeah, I get really, you know, passionate about this one, so I'll try to keep it short. But yeah, there's a lot of dominant narratives around AI that aren't unique to AI, but are amplified within this sort of big tech space, right? So there's an article called The Problem with AI is the Problem with Capitalism. And I do sort of, yeah, subscribe to, you know, that idea. That AI doesn't, there's some new problems, but mostly it amplifies existing problems, right? It creates a lot of friction in places where there has been friction, but we've just been like, oh, education, yeah, we probably need to change that, but, you know, we'll deal with it later. And then ChatGPT comes and we're like, later is now, we need to deal with this now. But similarly around like, yeah, like labor rights and lots of other stuff. And I would just like to, yeah, stress, and I think you're all, you know, probably aware of this, but how much these narratives around AI are created by a very small subsection of people, right? Elon and the gang, I sometimes call them, or the tech bros, whatever, that really have specific ideologies and values that you might align with, but might not align with. So I would just like to, yeah, stay critical of that and question AI outside of this, yeah, like stakeholder value over all else, efficiency as something, you know, as the ultimate good. The human experience, I think, is not really an optimization problem. And I think there's limits to like computational thinking and even rational thinking, right? Not everything is a problem to be solved through a formula. That's just not. The world is messy and fuzzy and weird, and people are weird. And that's okay, you know? So yes, think critical of like tech solutionism as well. Again, not everything can be solved through a tech like solution, even however smart. Because we've seen that, right? We've seen the more we progress, kind of also, we create lots of new problems. Yeah, and the things that kind of matter to us most, like friendship and love and freedom and expression and compassion and connecting and all of those things are also the things that computers understand the least, right? It understands, ooh, object, object. Data point, data point. It's very difficult to turn those things that matter to us most into data points. So there will always just be a massive gap between what computers, however, you know, intricate, can grasp and how we experience it. So I just think it's, yeah, really important to keep that in mind, you know. So yeah, that's not having it. Two things I've saw recently that I think are interesting. One is this article that on Vox, which drew parallels between kind of like Christianity, sort of middle age, you know, practicing of Christianity, a lot of like fear mongering, the promised land, and it was drawing like parallels between those narratives and those of big tech, and it really like clicked in my mind. And there was a specific, like the intro, like what if I told you 10 years from now, we would all be free of disease and discomfort? Like, what if, you know, all these kind of like, yeah, promises of like the promised land. And then it says like, oh, do you think this is, you know, like a middle-aged priest or a like big tech sort of AI advocate? It could really be both. And I was like, oh my God, that's really it. And so I think it's just, yeah, something to be mindful of, like anything that revolves just around fear and so on. I don't think it's really a good, you know, movement. And then the other one I think is also really interesting. It just shows like the bias in the model and how specifically a lot of the systems we use now are just very American worldviews. And so this one, somebody prompted, I think it was Midjourney, but I mean, it could be either of them, to create like a group picture of like Native American men. And it creates this, while historically, it would probably look a lot more like this. What's the gap? Well, the data that it's trained on is probably like scraped off internet, lots of Instagram selfies, you know, you're looking good, you're smiling. Like in our era, it's right, we smile in pictures, like that's what we do. But that's also a specific like cultural values and norms that don't necessarily translate. And I think this is a really strong visual depiction of that. And it's just, again, something to be aware of in the tools we use, how much they are, trained on a very subset of things. ChatGPT is really good at doing MIT exams and really bad at telling you anything about intersectional feminism. There's reasons for that, right? And I think this is like a very visual way of seeing that, whereas in language, sometimes it's a bit less obvious, like in your face. But since we're using that so much, just something to, like hold in our minds. Loading. Is loading here? What am I loading? Hey, I'm missing a slide. So this slide is supposed to say 5. No idea why that's not working. Anyway, my 5th, I think, like area for intervention for designers to apply themselves to, which I think is also the most important one and also the most maybe meta one, is to democratize literacy. So right now still, you know, a small group of people know what AI actually like is and how it works, right? And like can tell you the difference between, I don't know, even AI and machine learning and how those terms are used and how they're very fuzzy and how, you know, the confusion matrix works, or like what's the trade-off between precision and recall. And like, these are all these terms, right, that, define how AI is being sort of designed and deployed into our world. And I think one of the most important things we can do is like build our own literacy around AI so that we can have more constructive dialogue with our engineers and with other stakeholders and kind of manage those conversations in a way that everyone can understand, but also build other people's literacy, right? Like, and there's that classic mirror of the people that are often affected the most by these systems are also the ones least likely to be educated on them. And so let's flip that. Let's mess up that pyramid and build our own and others' literacy, not copying out being like, oh, it's too technical for me. You know, I don't get it. I'm not smart enough. Yeah, you are. Like, you get it. There's lots of material online that explains sort of like a designerly understanding of AI or AI for beginners. And while, you know, I still struggle to grasp some of the very like deep technical stuff, there's loads that you can, and it will just, empower you to make an impact because you speak the language. There was a nice slide with that, you know, it had a funny GIF and everything. Anyway. I don't know why it failed me. 2 projects I like in this space. One is called The Most Likely Machine by Artifact. It's made for kids. It's to explain predictive algorithms to kids in the cutest way. Like you have to like sort. It's about like best of class awards. And so you have to sort like Einstein and Frida Kahlo with like character traits and so on. But it's an incredible, I think, design project to show how can you make complex concepts accessible to a non-technical audience, even kids, in like a playful way that really practices that whole pipeline rather than just like telling people about it. So I really, really like that project. And the other one's a visual explainer by R2D3, cute name, that explains sort of how like housing price prediction algorithms work in a super visual way. And I think, again, so much of AI is very difficult to grasp or feels kind of abstract, right? It's not really this computational thinking and probabilistic thinking for a lot of us isn't necessarily something we're trained in or familiar with. So yeah, if you're a strong visual communicator, I think creating sort of infographics or visual explainers or these interactive tools for people to understand AI is, yeah, a super worthwhile endeavor. So those are my five things I think we can do as designers to help, yeah, steer AI in a direction that we feel good or at least better about. And I always like this quote, just like human-centered design has expanded or even, you know, shifted from the design of objects to design of algorithms. For me, design is just like an intentional shaping of the materials around you for an intended outcome, right? And that could be everything, could be then a material. That's why there's so many different like design disciplines and practices. But right now, so much of our world and our interactions and just how our world like moves and operates is made of data and algorithms and you know, machine learning systems. So like if that's the material that so much of our life is shaped by, then that's the material that we should, you know, bring intention to needing and shaping. So yeah, I do not have the answers. These are big, big challenges, like really huge. And some days they feel, you know, like paralyzing because they feel so big. But I do think these are all questions that I find worth spending time with, pouring my efforts into. And I would love to, yeah, hear from you at the roundtable, because I'm just sending. Please send back. I'd love to hear from you. So I'm doing a roundtable at 12:30. I have no idea what time it is now. I hope I'm in time. Cool. In 10 minutes, over there, one or two to that side. And some questions that I spend a lot of time thinking about and would like to hear your thoughts on at the roundtable. It's like, yeah, how do we shift our efforts from high-level agency to more like alignment and agency? How do we practice that? How can we use our design brains to, you know, translate that? How do we center present lived experiences over distant futures? So instead of, you know, utopian or dystopian thinking, existential thread, all of that, there's stuff happening right now. People are being impacted by these systems right now. And I think if we manage to address those, you know, it's more likely for those to extrapolate into the future. So how do we center that? Real people, current, you know, experiences, and how do we build this literacy, but also have more critical conversations without less fancy words? So I'm in a lot of different spaces, including a sort of more like artistic academia space where people use, you know, do a lot of like critical discourse and use big words. I love that, but I think it's also quite problematic because it excludes so many people from those conversations, right? Even the word discourse is like, I don't know, you're like, talk's not, like, yeah, just like how people talk. I'm like, oh, it makes sense. But by using, you know, a lot of this critical thinking, and I think that's, again, not just in AI, but in a lot of other things, like where people think critically and have meaningful ideas, often those are brought into the world with big words, which, again, then excludes the people that probably need to hear those ideas the most. So how can we, yeah, use less fancy words to, you know, revolve around the same ideas and challenges? And how do we do all this together, like in participatory ways, in care-centric ways? How do we, yes, center that in how we do everything? How can we make things like open, participatory, accessible, inclusive, is very difficult. But again, a question I think worth asking, right? Like, how can we practice these things with each other in the room, but also the people who weren't able to afford that ticket, that's, you know, to attend here today. How can we involve them? How can we talk to them to figure all this stuff out? Also, if you don't know who this is, Bell Hooks, incredible lady, if you care about these ideas. And finally, and this is what I'm thinking about a lot lately, it's like, how do we stay sane and have slow thoughts around fast technologies? Like, as people in a, you know, I don't know, troubled times, but also as designers in like incredibly fast-moving industries and like buzzy headlines every day that seem to change everything, and it always feels like you can't keep up with what's all happening. How do we manage to like pace ourselves? How can we have, like, how can we not get lost just in the busyness of, you know, all the headlines and keeping up with, I don't know, Wired and Y Combinator and how can we just, yeah, like be present with those challenges and not go crazy and be at home and stuff, you know? How can we stay sane as designers in, yeah, a crazy, what feels like a crazy sort of transitioning time in a really fast-moving industry? How can we be like snails? Is my, yeah, I'm thinking about the snail a lot these days. Okay, going to the end of this. So I'll be there in the round table. I would love to hear, you know, talks are nice, but hearing from you is, for me, much nicer. So I'd love to continue the conversation at the round table and or join the AX design community, where we're kind of having these conversations all the time in various ways. We also create a lot of like resources, sometimes more polished, sometimes more chaotic, around these ideas. And this is one of our, like, we call this like a digital garden, sort of around like community and critical AI, where we sort of collect ideas, people, books, articles, whatever like practices and things that feel meaningful in supporting all these quests that I just threw at you. So we'd love to continue the conversation there, and that's it for now. Thank you.